So we're going to talk a little bit about the history. We're going to go through that very fast, then talk about some of the usual side effects, and then I was asked to talk about treating the high.
It's got to put your wireless on.
Oh, that's why it fell
There
off.
you go. There you go.
All right.
We're back.
And let's see if this thing, nope, this thing is not working.
It's not working?
Maybe I'm,
Let me see.
well, we'll just,
It is now.
huh?
There it is.
Well, now it's not working at all.
When you press this button, it goes blank. That button turns it blank.
Okay, well, I didn't think I was pushing that. Anyway, let's move on here. I've been doing cannabinoid medicine since 2000. I've seen about 3,000 patients, and I helped start the American Academy of Cannabinoid Medicine, which is an effort to recognize those doctors that are practicing good quality cannabinoid medicine and really try and marginalize those doctors that are practicing minimalist medicine. We basically founded this in response to the doctor on Venice Beach who has a lady in a bikini out in front saying recommendation is $39.95, and you can see the line move in front of his office. We kind of thought that he was undermining the credibility of the medicine. Okay, and I've written these books that I mentioned. So cannabis has been a medicine for a very long time. Dr. Donald Abrams, who's an oncologist at UC San Francisco, likes to say that except for the period from 1942 until 1996, cannabis has been a medicine for 4,000 years. He's being a little bit conservative there because, as you can see, it's over 4,500 years. But hey, what's 500 years among friends? It's been in every major materia medica that's ever been printed. The Ping Sao Ching is thought to be the first materia medica, at least by Chinese oral tradition, and it was used for many things that we use it for today. Pain being one of the #1 reasons for people using cannabis. Migraines was a condition that Sir William Osler considered to be the founder of modern medicine. He said that in 1892 that cannabis was the best treatment for migraines. The #1 time to take cannabis is at bedtime. There's some people say that Jefferson didn't actually say this, which is too bad because it's a great quote if he did. Cannabis was in the United States Pharmacopoeia from 1854 until 1941. The major pharmaceutical companies marketed it. These were just some of them. In the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, cannabis was the third most common ingredient in patent medicines and prescription medicines after alcohol and opium. Interestingly, smoking cannabis is actually helpful for asthma. In the early part of the 20th century, there were at least 3 cannabis cigarettes that were marketed for asthma. This one was from France, then there was another one from Australia, and another one from India. In the 1920s, American physicians wrote 3 million prescriptions a year that contained cannabis. Now, you had this incredible, very successful propaganda campaign to marginalize cannabis. And nobody really knew what marijuana was. People, it's hard to believe today. People knew what cannabis was. People knew what hemp was. The very few Anglos were using marijuana. Lots of them were using cannabis, but very few were using marijuana. African Americans didn't use marijuana. They used Muggles or Mary Jane. And there was a much smaller Spanish-speaking population in the United States. So, I mean, the propaganda was not directed at the side effects, which we're going to be talking about later today. It's sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And for some reason, when we have drug laws, there are 2 or 3 things that seem to motivate them. One is that those people, whoever those people are, which is most of us people here, those people are working too hard and too cheap, and those people are despoiling virginal Protestant women. I don't know where you find all these virgins, but they were concerned about that. This poster, somebody pointed out to me that it was a racist poster, that the man there is actually African American. I guess you sort of have to be a racist to pick up on these subtleties here. By the way, my advice is never inject cannabis. All right, and of course we had Reefer Madness, threatens the establishment, and all this stuff. Okay, so the Marijuana Tax Act was probably the brainchild of the oil companies because they didn't care about marijuana, they cared about hemp. And DuPont was really the force behind the Marijuana Tax Act, not Hearst, not Anslinger. They were just, Anslinger was just an opportunist, really the greatest bureaucrat of all time because he created a problem where none existed. Anyway, DuPont was concerned because of the cellulose that's in the waste product of hemp, the core, the hemp hurd, which is all cellulose. And they made cellophane. It's a synthetic made out of cellulose, nylon made out of cellulose, rayon made out of cellulose. They also made sulfites that you make paper out of wood pulp and hemp, but you need 4 times as much sulfites to make paper out of wood pulp as you do out of hemp. So Dr. Woodward testified for the AMA against the Marijuana Tax Act, and he said, the AMA knows of no dangers from the medical use of cannabis. Well, who was this guy Woodward? I mean, is this some joker that came in off the street? Well, it happened that he was the Commissioner of Health for Washington, D.C. from 1893 to 1913, Health Commissioner for Boston, 1913 to 1919. Past president of the American Public Health Association in 1914, and had been the chief legal counsel. He was also a lawyer, in addition to being a doctor, for the AMA since 1924. So he knew all the places to check. And he was highly critical of the use of the word marijuana because he said, hey, the AMA almost didn't make it here. We didn't know what you were talking about. And he checked with all of these government entities. And what he testified to, he said, all that Mr. Anslinger has is a fistful of newspaper clippings. What he didn't know is that Anslinger wrote most of those newspaper articles. So I'm going to skip right through this, but the cannabis was certainly well respected by the medical community well into the 1950s. One of the first modern studies was done by Ramsey and Davis on epilepsy. They used synthetic THC. Which actually had a much better effect than Epidiolex, which the FDA just approved, which is largely CBD, showed a 39% decrease in the frequency of seizures in Dravet syndrome. These guys showed a 90 to 95% decrease in 70% of the small sample that they tested. I think most of you know the modern history and know about Dr. Meshulam, who characterized an isolated THC in 1964. Probably know about the Independent New Drug Program and that Robert Randall was patient number 1. There have been a number of reports that have come out and said cannabis is a medicine and that its side effects are not any greater than those of other drugs. That 1998 should be 1988. That's because my typist can't read my handwriting. And the DEA's chief administrative law judge in 1988, after a 2-year rescheduling hearing, recommended rescheduling cannabis to Schedule II. And if George H.W. Bush had accepted that, I wouldn't be here, you wouldn't be here, your local doc would be recommending this left and right. And in his finding of fact, the DEA's chief administrative law judge, Francis Young, found that cannabis was one of the safest therapeutic agents known to man. Now I'm going to talk about the side effects. All substances, all drugs have side effects. So just because cannabis has some side effects doesn't mean that it's not safe. And certainly when the DEA's chief administrative law judge, in his finding of fact, says it's one of the safest therapeutic agents known to man, he has a certain amount of credibility, at least with me. He said it was safer than eating 10 potatoes, so I eat a lot of rice now. Okay, so this is Dr. Meshulam. If I had more time, I'd tell you a nice story about him, but I don't. But he has really been, he and his lab in Hebrew University in Jerusalem have really been at the center of research on cannabis as medicine. He is brilliant and very generous with his knowledge. Okay, Marinol, this is, by the way, almost any time the government sets a policy dealing with drugs, they do exactly the wrong thing. In this case, they encourage the development of synthetic THC. Of course, that's more expensive than if you extracted it from the plant, but this way the government could still say that cannabis has no known medical use in the United States. Apparently they're ignoring the 31 states where it's legal, where the people there seem to think that it does have a known medical use. Interestingly, Marinol, which is THC, which is the euphorogenic component of cannabis, no abuse, no diversion. You don't have people standing on the street corner saying, hey, you want to buy some Marinol? Dependence is not included as a side effect. Now, in my practice, the side effects complaint far exceed complaints from Marinol than cannabis, and that's because unlike Marinol, cannabis has 512 constituents in it, 113 of which are cannabinoids, over 200 are terpenes, and one of the cannabinoids, CBD, tends to partially block the euphoria that's caused by THC. Now, what I found in just prescribing Marinol is, which comes in 2.5, 5, and 10 milligram dosages, that it gives me some idea of when people start saying, I don't like the way I feel. And a lot of the people that I write prescriptions for are because they have not used cannabis on a recreational basis and they are uncomfortable about using cannabis or going into a dispensary. So I say, look, we'll start you on the Marinol. It doesn't work as well as cannabis, has more side effects than cannabis, and it's more expensive, but you might feel more comfortable going into a CVS pharmacy than going into the local dispensary. So I found that at 2.5 or 5 milligrams, which a lot of conditions respond well to, like anxiety or attention deficit disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder. But when you get to 10 milligrams, there's a small group of people that say, well, I feel a little bit uncomfortable. When you get to 15 milligrams, maybe 20% of people say, I don't like the way I feel. And the way that you address that is you say, okay, why don't you get some cannabis that's 1-to-1 THC to CBD. And the CBD tends to block about a third of the euphoria that's caused by THC. So you got 15 milligrams, now you're taking 15 milligrams of CBD with your THC. It's like taking 10 milligrams of THC. I already mentioned to you about this, the DEA's chief administrative law judge. Now, Sativex is, even though the United States says that cannabis has no known medical use here, it does have known medical uses in most of the rest of the world. This product is produced by GW Pharmaceuticals in the United Kingdom, and it's legal in 24 countries in the world. The lobbyist for Sativex is the former top doc in the drug czar's office, and she says that this isn't cannabis, even though if any of you have seen Dr. Sanjay Gupta's documentary, you know that this is made out of cannabis, and that it was filmed partially in one of the 6 greenhouses that GW owns in the south of England. Each one of the greenhouses is a different strain. Each one has 10,000 plants. Now, Sativex is interesting because it is cannabis. It's a 1-to-1 ratio of THC to CBD. They did research on that starting in 1999 with people with multiple sclerosis. And what they found was that 85% of the people who used it, when the study was over, they opted to continue using it, meaning that their therapeutic effects that they got outweighed whatever side effects they had. So side effects with this medication, as with many medications, differ from person to person. The most common side effect was dizziness and tiredness. Said some people felt sleepy or giddy. And for most people, the side effects were only mild to moderate, and they didn't last for very long. And it obviously can be changed by altering the dose that you're using. Use a lower dose. So this is a 1999 Institute of Medicine. They took a very conservative report position. They said there was a low incidence of cannabis dependence. And they said, look, a lot of people have tried cannabis and most are not regular users and few become dependent on it. And they concluded that cannabis had medical value and that its side effects were similar to most prescription drugs that are on the market, which is much more conservative than you need to be. So one of the issues that comes up is drug dependency. Now, the term addiction is not a medical term, it's a political term. It's used to marginalize people, it's a pejorative term. The definition of addiction has been a moving target in the more than 50 years that I've been a physician. And there's a lot of factors that go into drug dependency, and you can see them up here. It's not that cannabis doesn't have some drug dependency. It's that according to two well-known substance abuse experts, Drs. Henningfield and Benowitz, the dependency risk for cannabis is less than coffee. I saw a doctor up in the state of Washington who lost their license because they were using cannabis medically. I'm wondering how many people have lost their license in the state of Washington for drinking coffee. Oh, there's Henningfield and Benowitz. All right, and they looked at withdrawal symptoms and the strength of the drug's reinforcing effects, the degree of tolerance produced, the degree of dependence produced, and the degree of intoxication. And this is the way that it plays out. Tobacco being the worst, worse than heroin, cocaine next, alcohol next, coffee next, and marijuana last. So there are some people who use too much cannabis. I mean, I have a very small number that have been patients of mine. In several cases, I asked them to leave for a number of reasons, not just their inappropriate use of cannabis, but they just weren't compliant patients. So the definition of cannabis dependency is closely linked to the legal status. One of the criteria is spending a lot of time procuring the substance. Well, if it's legal, you can walk into your local dispensary and it'll take you about 5 minutes. If it's illegal, then you have to go down to the parking lot where it isn't well lit and hope that the local black market entrepreneur shows up. The word addiction does not show up in the latest psychiatric manual that lays out all the psychiatric diagnoses. It's a DSM-5. So cannabis is not addicting. All right, that's something that I want to leave you with. Actually, very few things are addicting. Addiction is a term that was developed around opiates. And opiates probably, they certainly meet the traditional definition. But there have been any number of commissions around the world that have looked at cannabis. And all of these including the Schaefer Commission, which Nixon appointed. Well, he appointed 9 of the members and the Congress appointed 4. All of these commissions said, let's legalize small amounts of cannabis for recreational use. We're not even talking about medical use. And remember, there's a difference between the motivation for recreational use and the motivation for medical use. And I always tell people, don't confuse them. I mean, the goal when you're using cannabis recreationally is to socialize, to have fun, and to get really high. And the goal with the medical use is to have the maximum therapeutic effect with the least side effects. And very few people complain about getting too high. And you don't, one of the frequent side effects that you see with recreational use is something called hyperemesis. And what that is uncontrolled vomiting. Cannabis, like a lot of substances, a lot of therapeutic substances, when taken in small doses, will treat a condition, in this case nausea and vomiting, but in higher doses may actually cause the same symptom, the same condition that it's treating. And that's the case with hyperemesis. And you do see a lot of emergency rooms that have a lot of recreational users come in with that problem. I have never heard of a medical user having that problem, but I'm sure that there are probably some out there. These are just some guys going way back more than 50 years ago saying that there's the use of cannabis does not give rise to dependence. Rhys Jones is a psychiatrist who's a longtime critic of the medical use of cannabis, and he did this study to demonstrate that cannabis had withdrawal symptoms, and he demonstrated that it didn't. He gave people 200 milligrams of THC, the Marinol, and then after 30 days, this produced short-lived, mild, possible withdrawal symptoms because he used people who were heavy users of cannabis, so it's quite possible that they were self-medicating for their anxiety. And since the most common time to take cannabis is at bedtime, it seems likely that they also got that benefit of helping them sleep. Now, dose is really important. When people say, well, marijuana causes this, cannabis causes that, how much are they talking about? What strain are they talking about? Almost everything that you've heard regarding the adverse effects of cannabis, the opposite is true. For instance, you have this allegation that cannabis causes brain damage. Actually, cannabis is neuroprotective. Dr. Meshulam invented a semi-synthetic called dexabinol, which helps preserve neurons in the case of stroke and traumatic brain injury. This little inaccurate factoid comes from an overzealous researcher in the 1970s who exposed monkeys to cannabis smoke and then sacrificed the monkeys. And what he found was that there wasn't any damage. So, aha! He put a gas mask on the monkeys and gave them lots of cannabis smoke and damn little oxygen. And you know what? Lack of oxygen causes brain damage. So when he sacrificed these monkeys, they had brain damage. Nobody has ever been able to replicate this because nobody has been stupid enough to put gas masks on monkeys. Okay, so the reason that there have been no deaths from an overdose of cannabis is the body has an endocannabinoid system, and in other presentations I talk about the endocannabinoid system because that's why cannabis works as a medicine. And there are CB1 receptors largely in the brain, although elsewhere in the body as well, CB2 receptors that are largely in the immune system. There are few or no CB1 receptors in the brainstem. And the brainstem is what regulates a lot of our vegetative functions, including respiration. So when you die from an overdose of a drug, it's because you're suppressing respiration. And cannabis can't do that. So, I guess I do have something on the endocannabinoid system. It's really important. It's the largest neurotransmitter system in the human body. It's central to homeostasis, and we'll just move on. CB1, CB2 receptors, has a couple of neurotransmitters. The molecules are similar to cannabis, a couple of enzymes that metabolize that. I think I'm going to skip through this because I'm almost out of time. Retrograde inhibition is a way of modulating the speed of neurotransmission. You can see that that's important in terms of treating migraines or in terms of treating seizure disorder, as well as attention deficit disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. I won't go into this, but it's important. There's an article written by Elger and Nickel in December 2004 Scientific American that covers this very well. Well, we talked about the chemistry of the plant. I'm going to move on here. The entourage effect is very important. That's why cannabis is better than Marinol, because cannabis has 513 constituents, Marinol has 1. There's a lot of therapeutic applications of cannabis, and one of the reasons therapeutic applications are so broad is because it's the largest neurotransmitter system in the human body, and because it's central to homeostasis. And there's a lot of different ways of administering cannabis. You know, people say, well, smoking, that's bad for you. Actually, there was a researcher at UCLA that found out not that bad. That it actually prevents lung cancer, doesn't cause lung cancer. But if you don't like the idea of the respiratory route, or if you don't like smoking, you can vaporize. This just tells you how long it acts. So, some of the side effects: euphoria, feeling good, which generally is a good thing. Dysphoria, which is feeling uncomfortably high. Panic attacks, which you more frequently see in naive users who have used a high dose. Paranoia, same thing. Hyperemesis that I mentioned before. Drowsiness. One of the things that you need to be aware of is that the district attorneys never went to medical school, and they don't realize that the cannabinoids are fat soluble. And so if you're a regular cannabis user and you stop today, we would find 9-carboxy-THC in your urine a month from now. And we would find THC in your bloodstream a week from now. Now, I make a pretty good ancillary living testifying as an expert witness, and I've been amazed at how intelligent the juries are in understanding this. And most of the time, and I've been involved in some serious cases where people have been accused of murder. In one case, it involved the sister of Sandra Day O'Connor. And this guy, I mean, they found him guilty of recklessly negligent homicide, but not murder. So dysphoria is dose and experience related. If you get over 15 milligrams, some people are going to have dysphoria. At 30 milligrams, a lot more people are going to have it. The CBD tends to decrease about 1/3 of the euphoria. Maureen Dowd is a columnist for the New York Times, and she didn't understand that it takes 45 minutes to 75 minutes before the oral route has an effect. So she had a candy bar that was 100 milligrams of THC, 1 milligram of CBD. She broke off a 10 milligram piece, she ate it, waited 15 minutes, nothing happened. Another 10 milligram piece, 15 minutes, nothing happened. Hey, she figured I'm from New York. She was in Colorado doing a story. So she ate the whole thing and spent the next 6 hours in the fetal position. So, one of the best pieces of advice is to start low and go slow. So, here's some advice on treating the high. CBD. Well, first off, start low and go slow. I should have put that at the top. Then you want to use CBD with your THC. Then there's some terpenes, which are 100% legal. There are 200 terpenes found in cannabis. A couple of them are pinene and limonene, but you can take them, you can just get them at your local health food store. A lot of people, a street intervention is to bite down on a peppercorn. Peppercorns have, pepper has caryophyllene in it, which is another terpene, and it, like CBD, partially fits into the CB1 receptors, interfering with the euphoria that's caused by THC. Juicing the raw plant will avoid the possibility of dysphoria entirely, because the raw plant has all the cannabinoids in the acid form. And that carboxyl group makes the cannabinoid, or the THC, fit into the CB1 receptor differently than if you don't have it, if it's decarboxylated. Heat and drying decarboxylates it. The suppository form is something that people in Europe use when cannabis is used to treat cancer, because you use extremely high doses of THC and CBD. And the reason that the suppository form helps is that I'm getting the thing that I'm going way too long. Anyway, they have found that it can decrease the amount of 11-hydroxy THC, which is a intermediary metabolite of THC. I mentioned the allosteric binding that blocks that. The terpenes, I've already mentioned that. Juicing, we've talked about that. Dr. Courtney is the expert. If you're interested in juicing, you might Google his name. Suppositories, the pelvic floor is served by 3 veins. Only one goes to the liver, so this allows more adipose deposition and lowers the peak of the metabolic intermediary 11-hydroxy THC. So here's my advice. Know what you're doing. Come to the CBD Expo and listen to people who can give you some good advice. Start low, go slow. Recognize that if you get above 10 milligrams of just plain THC, some people are going to have euphoria, and a few people are going to have dysphoria. Remember what Maureen Dow didn't know, that the oral takes a while to be effective, and that if you take too much orally, you're going to have dysphoria for 3 to 6 hours. Okay, I think we know this guy. This was him as a younger fella. He went to Occidental, and according to one of his classmates, he was the #1 doper at Occidental. Okay, so here's the take home. Start low, go slow, be careful with oral consumption. Don't drive if you're impaired. I'll only charge you about $5,000, but your attorney will charge you about $15,000. So don't drive when you're impaired. And we know the CBD partially blocks euphoria, that the terpenes can be helpful, and also recognize that medically, in most instances, low doses are effective medically. You don't need to use high doses to treat anxiety, treat your attention deficit disorder. Rodney Dangerfield was a patient of mine. I can tell you that because he put it in his book. There's a picture of him looking at a piece of paper that's saying, here I am looking at the best piece of mail I ever got, a letter from Dr. Bearman telling me to smoke more pot. Now, that's not what I told him, but you might check our website, the American Academy of Cannabinoid Medicine. I think I mentioned them earlier. And this is the sales pitch here. I do have a couple of books with me if anybody's interested. This is a new one. It's not out yet, although I have a couple with me. It'll be out in about 10 days. And here's some references that you might check. There's a lot of good books out there. And that's me. Thank you very much. Why don't we take a couple of questions, if we may? Yeah, right there. And speak loud, even though you got a mic. I'm deaf as a post.
Yes, this works. So my first comment is on the nausea. I'd like to distinguish there's 2 different mechanisms. Nausea and vomiting usually is caused by anticipatory something, nausea, or chemotherapy. And hyperemesis, as far as I understand, is really the irritation of the upper esophageal tract and the throat that causes the coughing and vomiting. So I think those are actually 2 different mechanisms that are activated here. If you could comment on that. And the second question, are you familiar with the medication called Bedrocan?
Called what?
Bedrocan. From Holland, Bedrocan.
I talked to some of their people at conferences, yeah. you know more about the functioning, I guess, of the vagus nerve and nausea and vomiting than I do. The hyperemesis comment was a result of the head of continuing medical education at Cottage Hospital telling me they had a lot of patients there with hyperemesis. And I tended to look at this as the medication causing the very thing that it can treat when used in higher levels. But I'm not a gastroenterologist, and maybe we can talk about it afterwards. I can't answer your question. You've stumped the speaker.
Thank you, and I think we should solve the question of bedrocan. It's an interesting one. It's a flower in Holland that's patented as medicine.
Right.
Thanks.
There's a company that markets that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Please give Dr. David Bearman your warm applause.